This is Private Placement, Term Sheet Composition, and Due Diligence by Martin Cortez for Finance 139. We'll begin with private placement. Private placement is the offering of securities to a select number of investors. It is usually done by an entrepreneur or a startup company in which it uses or has a network of investors that it knows are suitable for its securities. This is used by, like I mentioned, entrepreneurs or startup companies in order to raise capital for its ventures or whatever its need may be. It is also used by other companies that wish to possibly remain private instead of going through a public offering and opening up its shares to the public. With that being said, uh, private placement is different from the initial public offering, otherwise known as an IPO, in that only a select number of investors are given the chance to purchase these securities, whereas in an initial public offering, it is open to the public. Uh, with that, it highlights an important feature of private placement, that is with the registration with the SEC. Because it is only sold to a select number of investors, um, there are regulations and sections in the Securities Act of 1933 that allow private placements to be exempt from registering their securities with the SEC. Primarily sections 3A 11 and section 4 2 of the 1933 Act, as well as Regulation D, are what allows the startup company or the entrepreneur to be exempt from registering with the SEC. Under the section 3A11 of the 1933 Act, it simply requires that the issuer does business and resides in the same state as the potential investors, therefore being a truly intrastate offering, meaning it cannot cross over state lines. Um, if it meets that requirement, then it is exempt from having to register with the SEC. Also, Section 4.2 or 4.2 allows the issuer to be exempt for registration given that the transaction or transactions is not a public offering. With it being a private placement, it automatically meets that criteria. If an issuer relies on any of these sections for exemption, it must also meet the following requirements. The offer is to be made directly to prospective investors without general solicitation or advertisement. The offering should be limited to insiders, such as company officers and family or sophisticated investors with a pre existing relationship with the company. Investors should be provided with at least recent financial statements, a list of risk factors, and an open invitation to inspect the company, um, otherwise known as a private placement memorandum, which we'll discuss in the next slide. Also, Regulation D allows companies to also be exempt from registering with the SEC. More importantly, Regulation D has 6 rules, of which will only cover 504, Rule 505, and Rule 506, since they pertain to the rules on how to be exempt from registering. Now, with Rule 504, uh, it is for transactions with no more than $1 million of securities to be sold in a consecutive 12-month period. The rules do not impose a ceiling on the number of investors, nor does it restrict on how many securities are to be offered or resold. Now, Rule 505 applies to transactions not exceeding $5 million in securities within a to be sold in a 12 consecutive months. It limits the sale to 35 non-accredited investors and an unlimited amount of accredited investors. Now, accredited investors are investors that are deemed sophisticated enough to be able to know or choose a wise investment. Those that are non-accredited are those that lack the business savviness, sophistication, to be able to make a sound judgment when it comes to investments. Now, Rule 506. Um, it has no dollar limitation on the offering, however, it does limit the sale to, once again, 35 non accredited investors and an unlimited number of accredited investors. However, with non accredited investors, it does require that they meet a certain standard either individually or with a purchaser representative. A purchaser representative is an individual who has the sophistication to make sound investment uh, judgments and is the one that will receive the PPM or any information pertaining to the investment. Private placement memorandum. The importance of a private placement memorandum is that it shows that a company has done all the necessary steps necessary in order to acquire capital. It also shows professionalism on behalf of the entrepreneur or the startup company. Um, the purpose of the PPM is to show the terms and the pretty much the details of the company offering these securities to these investors. It is necessary in order to be compliant with the exemption uh, sections of the Securities Act of 1933 and through Regulation D. Now, the composition of a PPM um, is quite complex. There is a cover page, a term sheet describing the specific terms of the investment, as well as legal disclaimers. Now, the cover sheet discusses the name of the company, how many units are being sold, as well as their price. The summary of offering is broken up into three sections. The first involves details about the company, results of the operation, and liquidity of capital resources. The second section details the securities being offered, the price per unit, minimum investment, offering period, investor suitability, subscription agreement, as well as how many common and preferred stocks are outstanding. The use of the proceeds, the plan of distribution, meaning who can sell securities such as officers or directors, and a disclosure of the limited transferability is also included in the securities offered section under the summary of offering. The third section in the summary of offering deals with available information. After the summary of offering, the risk factors are detailed. Such risks are limited operating history, changing technology, etc. are examples of some of the risks that would be discussed. An executive summary and business plan may also be found in a PPM. In this section of the PPM, the business overview along with strategies and the business plan can be found. There is information that provides insight on the management and operations of the company along with financial data. Incorporating revenue and expense models is also important and should be included in the financial model portion. The next section of the PPM deals with the use of proceeds, describing how the money being raised will be used and where and what the capital will be used on. Management compensation section follows, detailing who the key management members are and their annual salaries. The principal interest owners are also included, listing the names of individuals, the number of shares they hold, and their percentage of the overall equity. The capitalization section is next, describing how the company is capitalized, the number of shares authorized, and entitlements to the owning of common or preferred stock. Now, charts and explanations on how the company is capitalized, the effect of raising capital on the securities of existing stocks, and the risks involved are also included in this section. There is also a subscription agreement that once again has the price per unit. It reiterates that there is no regulatory review through the SEC, etc. It has a place to sign, requiring information such as the name, address, the amount the investor wishes to purchase. Lastly, there is a certificate of accredited investor status. Here the investor checks off the reason they are accredited investors, as described previously, under the definition of the Regulation D under the Securities Act of 1933. It is important to note that the PPM may vary as far as the details included, and the sections and information stated above serve as an example of the most common type of PPM prepared for entrepreneurs and companies. PPM creation. There are three methods for creating a PPM. The first method is through legal counsel or through an attorney. Um, this method ensures the document is in compliance with all national and state regulations. However, it does add on costs to the process, usually in the range of $5,000 to $20,000, and places the responsibility of soliciting and pitching it to new investors on the issuing company's management team. Since this method requires time for the management team to find and solicit the investment to investors, this method is recommended for those that already possess a well-established network of potential or motivated investors. The use of investment banks is another method in the creation of the PPM. This method can prove to be difficult in that many negotiations are required with the investment bank, and there are many different types of investment banks offering just as many promises on raising capital. This confusion is critical in that a wrong decision, or if not careful, the company may end up with an undesired deal or jeopardize the life of the company. There is, however, a compromise between the investment bank and legal counsel through the use of PPM specialists such as ppm.net. These firms specialize in this area, offering to create the placement memorandum and more. These type of firms, through specialization in this area, often develop methods to best suit entrepreneurs or companies. For example, in the case of ppm.net, it has found that the most efficient way to acquire capital is through the use of Regulation D. Term sheet. What is a term sheet? A term sheet is a set of terms of a proposed investment. The term sheet first states the amount of the investment and the type of security being discussed, whether it's common, preferred, or participating preferred stock. The composition of a term sheet is, of course, discussing the investment, the type of security, warrant coverage, pre-money valuation, ownership, management options, distributions, governance, consent requirements, and exit, meaning what's going to be the length of this investment. Due diligence. What is due diligence? Due diligence is a term used to describe the standard of care or investigation needed involving a business or person prior to committing or signing a contract. It's a group of concepts that vary depending on the transaction at hand. However, in its simplest form, it involves asking the right questions, examining practices or policies, along with financial information in order to make an informed decision. As mentioned, the scope of due diligence varies depending on the size and scale of the transaction involved, as well as the risks involved with the transaction. As Christine Comerford described in Bloomberg Business Week in an article entitled Small Business, there are 3 areas of financial due diligence. The first is an explanation of how the funds will be used, knowing what the proceeds are for, why they are needed, and making sure that the closing date is realistic, and how will the shares be valued. Second is an explanation for the business model or budget currently being used. Important things to look at here is the amount of cash on hand, timeline for funding, strategic milestones, budgets such as equipment expenses, etc., and funding options. It is important to review financial statement projections with a good, bad, and worst case scenario. Lastly, the last area to look at is the legal review. It looks at corporate structure, tax matters, unusual liabilities, and potential litigation that may arise. There are only a few other topics to discuss under each area. As mentioned before, depending on the type of transaction, there may be more to look at. Now, the importance of due diligence comes from the transactional point of view. Reviewing all the information and ensuring that it is accurate allows the buyer or investor to pay the appropriate price, or from the seller's point of view, it makes sure that the seller receives the most possible. It also, helps in making the right decision, as mentioned previously. It allows you to make an informed decision before actually closing the deal or signing the contract.